I have known Camilla Power for quite a long time, since she came along to a RAG meeting in, I think, 1989 with some rotten tomatoes, intending to sit at the back. And as soon as this geezer that claimed he knew something about magic, myths and fairy tales started speaking, she was intending to throw these rotten tomatoes at the speaker.
Here I am,
and
30 years later.
And the rest is history. Yeah. So, well, we're all animals, of course, as human beings, but this animal is a very unusual one because she won't be able to tell you whether she's a biological anthropologist, an evolutionary anthropologist, an archaeological anthropologist, or a social or a cultural anthropologist, because she's all those things in one. And that is actually partly because she was trained here at UCL, where at UCL, we don't do what most departments do, it's make you choose between, you're either going to do biological anthropology or you forget all that, you've got to do a completely different thing called social and cultural anthropology. Camilla was trained here under Leslie Aiello, extraordinarily, I don't know, influential and authoritative anthropologist, who directed the Werner Gren Foundation, was editor of Current Anthropology, and taught Camilla a lot of what she knows. And Camilla's thesis, PhD thesis here, was on signaling, sexual selection, kind of cosmetics, but patterning and beauty, if you like, in animals as well as humans. And I think it's true to say that in the course of doing that work, she came across periodicity, sun, moon, and I don't know, to cut a sort of long story short, she's one of the inventors, perhaps the inventor of the very concept of lunarchy. And lunarchy means neither matriarchy nor patriarchy, but lunarchy, which means rule by the moon. And if you don't feel that rule by the moon is important, you're probably a victim of colonialist mentality, because of course colonialism and basically patriarchy in general thinks that the moon is very, very dodgy. So patriarchal religions, the Catholic Church. I was brought up in the Catholic Church, and the Catholic Church has a problem with two things, really, basically. One's women, and the other's the moon. And I think Camilla's going to ask and suggest that we kind of break out of these strange hoops and constraints that we're all being trapped under for so long, and celebrate lunarchy and work towards decolonizing time itself.
Thank you very much, Chris. The alternative title for tonight's talk is, Lunarchy, Decolonizing Time, but also how to breathe. Because we can't breathe, we humans, the voice, breath of the planet at its most conscious living organism, we can't breathe. We need to breathe in and out deeply, take a long view for our planet and all the Earth's organisms. Panicking now would be an absolute disaster. To return to a breathable rhythm, we need to decolonize time. We're dazzled by constant brightness, rarely see the dark sky, screens flickering day and night as 24/7 capitalism never stops. When we evolved as hunter-gatherers, before patriarchy, our productive activities, joys and sufferings were aligned with the risings and settings, day and night, of sun and moon, and seasons turning. For certain, no indigenous people before being colonized ever used man-made months. They used Earth, Moon, Sun systems, aligning all social life to the cosmos. The tides, nesting and migration of birds, the changes of the moon, germination of seeds, fruiting of trees. The ultimate expression of white supremacy is control of time itself through the Gregorian calendar, absolutely dominant across the planet, which has subdued cosmological and ecological time. Conquistadors and imperialist freebooters venturing forth with their express intent to rob, deracinate native modes of cyclical time and propagate in their place peculiar concepts such as time being wasted or spent, that time was actually money. capitalism as a system emerged from this background of forced labor, and it robs us of our time. Marx said, in the final analysis, all forms of economics can be reduced to an economics of time. How a society organizes and distributes time reveals what it truly values. The more any person has time taken away from them, eroded and devalued by poverty wages, the greater degrees of inequality. So in the first part of this talk, I'm going to sketch a history of how tighter and tighter control of time, from hours to minutes to seconds and even fractions of seconds, has led to ever greater economic exploitation. In the second part of the talk, I'll then ask, how could we organize time in a way that could turn back inequality? What can indigenous and egalitarian societies teach us about the passage of time? So let's now think about time's connections with imperialism. The hourglass actually starts this off. And sadly, Extinction Rebellion has adopted that hourglass as its emblem, but this has strong connections with the church, Christian patriarchy, and imperialism itself. Church canonical hours, which dictated fixed times for prayers and activities in Christian patriarchal monastic orders, began to take the divisions of time away from nature. And then we had the feudal nobility, noble women, aristocratic ladies, following the monastic discipline of time and motion of these prayer times, of these singing and prayers, using breviary, so that at their respectable distance from where the monks were in their seclusion, these noble women would be performing the same rituals. Meanwhile, the serfs who were laboring for feudal landowners, they might snatch work breaks with sand glasses, little sand glasses that were measuring the time that they could take a break. As time grew linear, trickling forever between one bulb of glass and another, the concept of tempus fugit, the idea of a shortage of time, impressed itself on European Christendom. And the imperialist voyages of so-called discovery, the European voyages of exploration, which mapped out the colonial future, really depended on the hourglass in the beginning. Magellan's circumnavigation of the globe used 18 giant hourglasses from Barcelona, which were used to keep the ship's log, keeping track of the hour in the home port against local noon, the sun at zenith. And that was the only way he could work out where he was, east to west, on the surface of the earth. But of course, the real starting line of the imperialist takeover of time, if you like, was the Royal Observatory, built at Greenwich, 1675-6, which established what was going to become known as the prime meridian. That was the imperial standard of measurement of time and space across the earth. Even to this day in Greenwich, where they dropped the ball at 12 noon, which was the signal that went out to all the ships that were lying up on the Thames, waiting for the right tide. So this was like a starting gun for those ships to spread across the surface of the earth and begin extracting from the colonies. The observatory housed the Astronomer Royal, whose express job description was to apply himself to the rectifying of the tables of the motions of the heavens and the places of the fixed stars, so as to find out the so much desired longitude of places for perfecting the art of navigation. Solving the problem of longitude, location from east to west on the surface of the earth, was vital to the voyages of imperialist exploration and conquest. Initially, a cosmological approach was taken, aiming to understand the wandering motion of the moon and its eclipses and tabulate these very precisely. But by the 1750s, John Harrison's chronometer, the Marine Watch H4, which is now enshrined like a sacred relic at Greenwich, proved very practical and accurate. On his first voyage, James Cook used the lunar distance method to calculate east-west position, but he took K1, which is an exact replica of H4, on his later voyages and produced his famous charts of the Southern Pacific, planting the first Union flag on Botany Bay, April 1770. So that's talking about hours division, but let's go on to what happened with time under capitalism. And I'm going to rely on the historian E.P. Thompson and his brilliant essay, Time, Work Discipline and Industrial Capitalism, who traces how and when clocks, especially clocks with minute hands, began to impact working people's lives in England. This process was intimately associated with the onset of industrialization and the accompanying enclosures, forcing many off the land into slums, factories, and workhouses. And it also lies at the root of our entire education system, indoctrinating children into time thrift. People working on the land could fairly well disregard clocks. Okay, church bells chased them up in the morning, but so too did cock crow. This was natural signals. The natural limits of dawn to dusk gave customary expectation of what could be done in a single day. Fishermen and sailors had to attend to the lunar rhythm of tides, but time was fundamentally task-orientated, said E.P. Thompson. Work was organized by what needed to be done in accordance with seasonal organic rhythms. Task orientation involves the least demarcation between work on the one hand and life on the other. Social life and labor can run together. And there's little conflict between labor and passing the time of day. This holds true above all for independent peasants or craftsmen, artisans. But as soon as someone's labor is employed by another, a sharp distinction emerges of the employer's time and a worker's own time. The value of time is monetized. Time is now currency. It isn't past, but spent. As long as manufacturing was done in a small-scale workshop or cottage industry, with family members engaged in the division of labor, the socially flexible, irregular labor patterns under task orientation would prevail. Many workers had a kind of variety of occupations, so people could be miner in one season, fishermen in another, or farmers and weavers were weaving with the wool they produced in the farm. Domestic workers would be called in to join in the harvest. So no single day's work would look exactly like another, and much of it would be paid piecework. Thompson pays special attention to a traditional irregularity of the working week. If artisanal workers were paid for goods delivered by Saturday, and then they drank away the Sabbath day's rest, they frequently treated Saint Monday as another day off. With a wage in their pocket, they were in no hurry to get back to work. This tradition of workmen's autonomy was a major stumbling block for large-scale machine industry, as factory owners and foremen tried to make sure their workforce turned up on time. At the beginning of the turn of the 18th century into the 19th century, so around 1800, Saint Monday, sometimes followed by Saint Tuesday as well, was observed among all trades: shoemakers, tailors, colliers, printing workers, potters, weavers, hosiery workers, cutlers, all cockneys, said. Thompson uses diaries to show the frequently hectic pattern of the working week. Time off on Monday plus Tuesday meant longer and longer hours towards the week's end to meet the contracted orders. Thompson says this work pattern of alternate bouts of intense labor and then idleness occurred wherever men, and it was men, were in control of their own working lives. He suggested it might be a natural human work rhythm. But there were sexual conflicts, and I'm going to go to the slides. I hope people can see those, this, and I'm going to read through this song. Sexual conflicts entailed in the way skilled laborers drank up their wages, and this was voiced in a late 18th century Sheffield song called The Jovial Cutlers. Brother workmen, cease your labor, lay your files and hammers by. Listen while a brother neighbor sings a cutler's destiny. How upon a good Saint Monday, sitting by the smithy fire, telling what's been done on Sunday and in cheerful mirth conspire. Soon I hear the trapdoor rise up. On the ladder stands my wife. Damn thee, Jack, I'll dust thy eyes up. Thou leads a plaguey drunken life. Here thou sits instead of working, with thy pitcher on thy knee. Curse thee, thou'd be always lurking, and I may slave myself for thee. Ah, the bright fat idle devil, now I see thy goings on. Here thou sits all day to revel, ne'er a stroke of work thou'st done. See thee, look what stays I've gotten. See thee, what a pair of shoes. Gown and petticoat half rotten, ne'er a whole stitch in my hose. Pray thee, look here, all the forenoon thou's wasted with thy idle way. When dost thou mean to get thy sours done? Thy mester wants them in today. Thou knows I hate to broil and quarrel, but I've neither soap nor tea. Od burn thee, Jack, forsake thy barrel, or never more thou'st lie with me. I think we're getting the point here. Yeah. Well, I mean, I've highlighted a few of those lines about this woman, as a workman can apportion his time and he's paid for that time. A wife, her household labors unpaid and never done. I may slave myself for thee. And she's pointing especially to the state of her underwear, the holes in her shoes, the holes in her stockings, her petticoats torn. This is very symbolic of what she needs, what she wants. The sours there are the unmade articles that have already been sold to the contractor. And she doesn't have soap. Cleanliness, respectable attire that a woman's demanding could have been one of some of the very most important factors in mobilizing time discipline imposed on men. Nevermore thou'st lie with me. Her only threat is a bit of a nuclear option to say you're not going to have any more sex with me. And she's all by herself. She hasn't got a collectivity of women and a trades union telling her backing her up in the sex strike. Okay. So it's all a bit drastic. But this trope, this meme, this trope of this complaining, nagging wife or complaining woman, and the last verse of that Jovial Cutler's song is quite misogynistic. It's the men mocking the wife. So I left that one out there. But this idea of women's complaints against their husbands was often posed against rambunctious male idleness. And when it comes to the rural labor, which was at that time period under pressure of enclosure, which was removing access to common land where people could get some kind of autonomy from being able to graze animals, and also agricultural improvements of so-called productivity. Increasingly, that was forcing the rural laborers to a much better work discipline because they were under punitive threats of unemployment. There were too many people on the land, the Poor Law, Vagrancy Act, the possibility of the workhouse. This is why people were flooding from the countryside into the towns, into the horrendous living conditions of the slums. And Thompson recognizes that rural laborers' wives had the very most arduous, prolonged hours because they had childcare, housework, domestic chores, and then they would be pulled into work in the fields as well. So it was like never ending. So as Thompson traces this transition period from what he calls highly developed, technically alert manufacturing industries arising in the 18th century, the 1700s, to the mature industrial capitalism of the 19th century, the peak of Victorian imperialism. He takes what I think is an anthropological view, that the stress of the transition falls on the whole culture. Resistance to change and assent to change arise from the whole culture. And this culture includes the systems of power, property relations, and religious institutions. All of that, we've got to take all of it into account. Among the reasons why this transition was so protracted and fraught with conflict in England was simply that, well, England's was the first industrial revolution, and there was no kind of great British dream there acting as a kind of inspiration for the workers, that they could get all these luxuries, they could get all these goods like Cadillacs or television sets, like we have the Great American Dream much, much later down the road. So there were no such spurs for the impoverished slum and tenement dwellers in Manchester, in Glasgow, in Merthyr Tydfil. Thompson looks at one of the very oldest testaments of time discipline, which was the law book of the Crowley Iron Works, dating to 1700, this really early stage. At the very birth of large-scale unit manufacturing industry, the owner of the ironworks found it necessary to design an entire penal civil code running to more than 100,000 words to govern and regulate his refractory labor force, just to make him turn up on time. This had all the features of disciplined industrial capitalism: timesheet, timekeeper, informers, fines, as much punishment as possible, more stick than carrot. A whole doctrine and propaganda of time thrift emerged, inculcated by religious and educational institutions aimed at the poor, whose idle, ragged children were not only losing their time, but learning habits like gaming, dice, gambling. Charity schools multiplied to teach industry, frugality, order, regularity. The scholars here are obliged to rise betimes and to observe hours with great punctuality, would be an advertisement for these charity schools. In other words, England's education system was founded to train children to use their time for the boss's profit. They were just being prepared to turn up on time for industrial labor. And of course, a large part of that industrial labor consisted of child labor force who barely saw more than the inside of Sunday school. Thompson notes the stages of resistance to this, what he calls onslaught upon the people's old working habits, their old autonomy. First came simple resistance. People just stuck their heels in. They didn't want to do this. But in the next stage, as the new time discipline was imposed, so the workers fought, not against time, but about it. It was in the industries, textiles and engineering, where the new time discipline was most rigorously imposed, that the contest over time became most intense. These were the industries which had the biggest arrays of complex machinery that you couldn't just turn on one machine and another, you had to the whole lot had to go up all at once. All the workers had to be in their station, including the little children who were like running under to pick up the wool bits and so forth, risking their lives in these ways. So Thompson says the first generation of factory workers were taught by their masters the importance of time. The second generation formed their short time committees in the 10-hour movement. The third generation struck for overtime or time and a half. They had accepted the categories of their employers and learned to fight back within them. They had learned their lesson that time is money, only too well. Benjamin Franklin, who was regularly on time working as a printer in 1720s London, Smithfield, gave full expression to the new capitalist Puritan ethic. Since our time is reduced to a standard and the bullion of the day, minted out into hours, the industrious know how to employ every piece of time to a real advantage in their different professions. And he that is prodigal of his hours is in effect a squanderer of money. I remember a notable woman who was fully sensible of the intrinsic value of time. Her husband was a shoemaker and an excellent craftsman, but never minded how the minutes passed. In vain did she inculcate to him, time is money. So we've got that voice of the complaining woman again. Thompson summarizes, in all these ways, by the division of labor, the supervision of labor, fines, bells and clocks, money incentives, preachings and schoolings, the suppression of fairs and sports, of holidays, new labor habits were formed and a new time discipline was imposed. Through the 19th century, workers were incessantly bombarded by propaganda of time thrift. The leisured classes, who of course had all the time they wanted at their disposal, began to discover the problem of the leisure of the masses. As documented by Marx and Engels, the original proletarian class struggle of the 19th century took place on this battleground over time. Today, that battle has been transported to every corner of the earth, South and East Asia, Central America, the Middle East and Africa, the same patterns arising as people are forced off the land, which grants them a certain autonomy, into time-regimented factories. Listen to the words of an Indian woman worker reported November 2020 from a rural South Indian factory scrambling to meet orders from fashion giant Ralph Lauren. We're made to work continuously, often through the night, sleeping at 3 a.m., then waking up on the factory floor by 5 a.m. for another full day. Our bosses don't care. They're only bothered about production. Similarly, workers at supermarket suppliers, including Marks and Spencer, suppliers of Marks and Spencer, Sainsbury's and Tesco, said, we don't get toilet breaks. We don't get time to drink water on shift. We barely get time to eat lunch. Often forced to work overtime, not allowed home until all contracted work is finished. These women were harassed and bullied under threat of losing jobs. One objected they shouldn't treat us like slaves. Conditions resemble modern slavery with almost complete alienation of time, loss of control of one's time. But rich first world economies don't alleviate exploitation of workers trapped and intimidated into accepting less than the minimum wage. Witness, for instance, during the COVID pandemic, conditions in Leicester textile sweatshops, the summer of 2020. It was found to be a rife COVID hotspot, but workers couldn't possibly afford to take time off, nor were they being given any leave to do so by their bosses. They were under pressure always to be turning up. In China, Uyghur, Tibetan, North Korean workers were forced into factories to meet vast emergency orders for PPE and treated as virtual slave labor. Meanwhile, the world's original proletariat, English, Scottish, and Welsh workers, have lost their jobs and former organizational solidarity in manufacturing industries that have now gone global. Now they scramble for the crumbs of a post-industrial gig economy. They're no longer clocking in by the minute. They become subject to intense surveillance as they try to meet delivery targets and times with actions and GPS locations recorded to the second. In this new order of time and space discipline, every second is made to count by punitive fines, pay deductions, if they fail to get deliveries to the right addresses through gridlocked traffic. Ken Loach's film, Sorry We Missed You, tells the story of a self-employed delivery driver succumbing to the stress of work patterns that lack any fallback for sickness, time off, family troubles, just no time to be human. At the other end of the scale of casino capitalism, high-frequency trading on the world's stock exchange now operates on a basis of nanoseconds, tiny fractions of seconds, with investment banking and hedge fund manipulation, shorting of stock values at incredibly small fractions of time. That is basically where all the profit is, to be able to make decisions on these incredibly small fractions of time. The priority of these systems is completely given over to roller coaster, algorithmic profit seeking at the expense of any form of stability or security for producers of commodities or assets. Securities and futures become oxymoronic labels for complete insecurity of an unsustainable future. At the stroke of a keyboard in London or New York or Tokyo Stock Exchange, livelihoods can be wiped out on the other side of the world. This is the ultimate expression of capitalism's control of time, triumphant in the ability to extract more and more value from tiny divisions of time, leaving a workforce completely zombified and bloodless, desperate to pay rent on precarious zero-hour contracts, lacking a pulse or breathable rhythm for human social life, as our planet is hurtling into ecological catastrophe. So I've talked about just the history of these tighter and tighter divisions of time, hours to minutes to seconds, tightening the screw of ever greater economic exploitation. And now what I want to do is ask, well, what could we do? How could we organize an economics of time in a way that would turn back inequality? What can indigenous and egalitarian societies teach us about the passage of time for human beings? What human resources do we have for slowing down the rhythms of our economy and redistributing time? It is not true that capitalism has stripped out all reference to cosmological time, because existing alongside and within capitalist economy, in sometimes uneasy, sometimes symbiotic relationship, are patriarchal religions able to thrive in capitalist conditions. Now, virtually all these so-called world religions maintain calendars which are very unlikely to be patriarchal in their origin. They're all organized by lunar time. In fact, it could be a defining feature of religion to work with the moon. The moon is the source of magic, transformation, the other world. It's the fundamental metaphor of life, death, and resurrection. So is there any religion that doesn't refer to it? Now, I don't believe patriarchy can have invented the lunar time frame. It's inherited these forms of marking time from earlier religions that we've lost knowledge of. As institutionalized, what I take to be patriarchy is institutionalized ritual, symbolic, and political superiority of men over women. Patriarchy has a very complicated relationship with the moon. The Neolithic farming immigrants to Britain who built Stonehenge, their ancestors came from Anatolia, so it was immigrants who built Stonehenge, went to extreme lengths to transform the moon's ritual powers into those of the sun. A process called the solarization of the moon by our late colleague Lionel Sims. The Gregorian calendar, which derives from the old Roman Julian calendar, uses man-made months named after emperors to impose a grid onto the solar year. And quite uniquely, the Gregorian calendar detaches us entirely from reference to moon cycle. You cannot make any, using man-made months, you cannot make any sense in relation to lunar cycles. You're only scrambling to kind of catch up with the moon one way or the other. Christianity took on the old, I'm just going to remove that background again. I don't know why. If I touch a wire, it goes, yeah, it's all right. I can pretty much see it comes in my eyes. So Christianity took on the old winter solstice festivals, Christmas, and try as it might, it couldn't ditch the lunar schedule of its major ritual at Easter. Now, all the imputations that go, in kind of the Enlightenment heritage of lunacy, lunatic, moonshine, moonstruck, all associated with some unstable, hysterical, irrational kind of feminine in the sort of Enlightenment rhetoric. But in actual fact, material fact, the 17th to 18th century astronomers formed a scientific male secret society, the Royal Society, which is still with us, obsessed with the movements of the wandering moon. Because, as we've said, until clocks became accurate at sea, the empire needed science of the moon for calculating the all-important longitude. The European Enlightenment inherited superstitions about women and the moon from Greek and Roman, very patriarchal Greek and Roman authors. Cosmological beliefs about connections between women and the moon are known in traditional cultures worldwide. Now, usually these are still today treated by scientists with skepticism as, again, a form of irrationality. But while it is absolutely true, there's a very important book just written by Kate Clancy, a scientist on period about menstruation. It's absolutely true that any individual woman has variable cycle lengths. Women vary between themselves. But now, as menstrual apps collect large quantities of data, even with women with Western lifestyles, if you've got all those large quantities of data and you calculate averages, these closely approach the mean menstrual cycle length comes closer to the lunar synodic cycle length, that is 29.5 days. Now, the 28 days, a bit of a myth. Well, 28 days actually applies to older women, maybe women in mid-30s, older. But 29.5 days, the lunar length, really applies to fertile menstrual cycles of women in their 20s when they're peak fertility. If women in their 20s, quite low BMI as an index of weight to height, body weight to height, come very close to lunar length cyclicity. And during our evolution, the reason BMI is significant there is during our evolution, humans would have been low end of the scale of BMI, low normal end of the scale of BMI rather than the other end. And it's beginning to look as though women may actually have evolved a menstrual cycle length and a pregnancy length, which is 9 times the lunar length, in relation to the moon as part of an ancient hominin lunar ecology. Okay, so really deep time evolution here. So let's just think of the scenario of our ancestor Homo erectus, African ancestor Homo erectus, living in increasingly open savanna conditions in the early Pleistocene, 2 million years ago, 1.5 million years ago. The landscape they're operating in is full of terrifying predators. In total darkness, there are huge felines, big cats, very big cats, hyenids. These creatures have superb night vision. Groups of Homo erectus women and children would have needed to plan defenses with techniques of mass mobbing and chorusing to deter predators. So Chris, with Jerome, has written a wonderful article, Wild Voices, talking about this potential evolution of chorusing and singing as a source of potentially why there would be collective singing, polyphonic singing forms, particularly associated to the dark of the moon, because this would be the most scary time in relation to those predators. Even a small glimmer of moonlight is sufficient to stop big cat hunting. You know, lions are lazy creatures. If they don't want to run very far, they want to ambush their prey when they can see and the prey can't. Even to this day in Africa, lion predation of humans is phased by the moon, and it correlates with the darkness in the sky. No moon in the sky. It's actually really dangerous after the full moon, when there's a gap of darkness before the moon rises, and humans are walking about and socializing. That is danger time with the lions. So in the Pleistocene, timing of social, sexual, and reproductive activity in relation to moonlight would have been very adaptive in that evolutionary environment. So why are we delving into the Pleistocene here? I'm suggesting we have two human universals. One is cultural, and it's relatively recent. The other is biological, and it's baked into our bodies by evolution over a long time scale. Religions the world over are lunar organized. Their calendars are lunar. Women the world over have evolved lunar length cycles, of lunar length periods to their reproductive cycles. So does this suggest that the template for reclaiming human, breathable, cosmic time should be lunar? Let's look at some deep time connections. So I'm going to talk about trickster time, or Lunarchy here. Now, while the world religions such as Hinduism, Judaism, Islam are indisputably lunar in their calendars, there's some ambiguity over Christianity. It overlays old pagan agricultural solstice and quarter day feasts with what we've just had, the lunar scheduled passion tide of Christ. It's solely lunar. Following Judaic Passover tradition, Easter falls on the first Sunday, and the 7-day week is itself a unit of lunar time. After the Paschal full moon, after March 21st, approximation of the vernal equinox. Today's world religions are extremely young. They're only 4,000 or 5,000 years old at most, and inherited their lunar phasing from lost Neolithic forebears. But just how old could this lunar time frame of religion be? Something very interesting happened when ancient Bushman peoples of the Kalahari began to meet missionaries who propagated Jesus. The Bushmen themselves, in their culture, told stories and danced with a panoply of gods and spirits. They were entities with a whole variety of names that governed healing, hunting, and menstruation. When Christian priests, teachers, and farmers heard about these trickster-like beings, they called them devils. They had no hesitation to call them devils and equate them with Satan. But the Bushmen had a different idea. The more they got to hear about Jesus, the more it became clear to them Jesus was a trickster. In Tricksters and Trancers, a book by Matthias Günther, who's an expert of Bushman religion, he discusses how people from various Kalahari groups, Twasi, Naro, Hua, some of them missionized, others farm Bushmen working as very cheap labor for the colonial farmers, yet others who were still living life close lived in the bush. They tend to identify or conflate Jesus Christ with the trickster. Similarities include involvement in healing and a tendency to chat up women at wells and waterholes. But the main structure that aligns Jesus with tricksters like Power or Haisep are the death and resurrection. Being beaten, torn apart, and killed is a plight also of the trickster, suffered many times over whenever one of his misdeeds backfires. But the trickster has this uncanny ability to spring back to life, first in parts and then as a whole, able to ascend to the sky. This power to come back from the dead, linked to healing, is symbolically governed by the moon, like Easter. Other connections can be made. For instance, there's a very common motif of tricksters offering parts of themselves, like viscera or buttocks or genitals, as food, because they failed lamentably in the hunt and they dare not face their wives. Body and blood, Holy Communion. I saw a lot of memes over this past Easter where people were passing around social media the images from illuminated manuscripts of the wound in Jesus's side, which is actually made out as bleeding female genitalia, literally bleeding cunt. Yeah. So Jesus seems to be a menstruating male as he's undergoing crucifixion. And that would be very much the category of trickster, lunar periodic blood flow and gender ambiguity. But the most basic factor that makes an identity between Jesus and trickster lies in organization of time. In Eclipse on the cross on Good Friday, Jesus nails down time for the Christian calendar of movable feasts, organized by that point. Trickster is an algorithm of time. In the Khoisan Bushman cosmology, tricksters strongly tied to two entities that grow large and fade in a cyclical time pulse. One is the great eland antelope, which is really the most sacred creature of Khoisan cosmology, the great male eland bull antelope with all the fat it carries. And the other is the moon. Trickster governs first menstruation rituals for girls by prowling around on guard around the menstrual hut. The first menstruation ritual is known for Kalahari peoples as the eland bull dance. It's an ancient Kalahari ritual timed by the moon. A girl is released from her seclusion with the new moon, so she grows fat, and the eland will grow fat for the hunter. As the moon comes to full, the hunter can complete the kill. Women of the camp dancing in the eland bull dance in a figure of 8 around the menstrual hut, they flash naked buttocks as they're singing and stepping to some of the very oldest music in the world, polyphonic music called the Rain Eland scale, singing these polyphonic songs. Men can only admire but not approach close to this seclusion hut. Her potency is called Ngom by the Jeune Poissy, and it provides a kind of rocket fuel to carry the entire community with her into what's known as first creation. This is a time beyond time when nothing is fixed, everything is changing. Humans are animals, animals, humans. And this is a time a trickster is the gatekeeper of first creation. The girl, the menstrual girl in her hut, is at the center of the Bushman universe. And this dance is the most probable candidate for the longest continuous religious tradition of humanity. At a guess, 70 or 100,000 years old. So this is return to first creation, indeed, still being danced in places. Now, I'm going to show a couple more images of religious icons of hunter-gatherers, just to give more of a, again, more of an idea of how deep time is this lunar cultural time frame. On the left, famous European image of Venus of La Selle, and this is from Zimbabwe. Again, hunter-gatherer culture in Zimbabwe of many thousands years old. And it gives us some indication of how old the lunar ritual time frame is. The rock carving from France, a rock painting of Zimbabwe. So they're separated by thousands of years and thousands of miles. But they look really quite similar. Their grammar is very similar. The famous Venus of La Salle, a bas-relief of a Dordogne rock shelter, is about 25,000 years old, belonging to Gravettian culture. She was originally rubbed with red ochre from the belly button down over the vulva to the thighs. And it's still detectable, but it's not visible anymore. She holds an animal horn, which is sometimes called a bison horn, but also often an ibex, which has an enigmatic scoring of 13 marks. Later this term, we're going to have a Zoom with Bernie Taylor, who I think is here with us tonight, and he's going to be telling us a lot more about the lunar timekeeping of Upper Paleolithic rock of art. The Zimbabwe image from the Matapos Hills is harder to date. It's certainly older than 2,000 years. It's from before any cattle came into that area, so it belongs to the prime era of hunting cultures of Khoisan inhabitants. It could be as old as 10,000 years, according to the work of Peter Garlick. It's painted in red ochre, a female figure who's fat with potency. Fat there, P-H-A-T, with power. It's not a literal fatness. It's making her out as very powerful. Rainbows of blood going from between her thighs, going up to these great horned antelope, eland or Hemsbok antelope. Both of these ancient European and African religious icons show connection of women, their blood, the moon, to the horned game. Thousands of years, thousands of miles apart, and that similarity. Lunarchy, which is a joking coinage of lunacy, to subvert the old patriarchal put-downs, and anarchy, is personified by the trickster. As trickster time, Lunarchy oscillates between the waxing and the waning moon, aligning ritual, sexual, and economic activities by lunar phase. This gives a continual switching of power between the sexes. In Blood Relations, Chris Knight outlined the sex strike model of human culture, born in a revolution when women went on strike. Women with their kin, sons and brothers, would celebrate ritually at the dark of the moon, signaled by menstrual blood, whether that was real blood or cosmetics. As the moon waxed and the night sky got brighter to full moon, men would go hunting for large game, bringing back kills to their wives' camp. For the full moon, a full moon feast, when all the taboos on marital sex and meat were relaxed, so the fire would lift the blood from the bodies of women and the bodies of the animals. At the next dark moon, women would go on sex strike again to keep that cosmos turning. This syntax, waxing versus waning, raw versus cooked, blood versus fire, kinship versus marriage, persists at the core of all magical myths, fairy tales, and ritually derived narrative dramas. We went over several fairy tales and myths last term, the Wawalak sisters with the rainbow snake and the Sleeping Beauty the term before, as examples. For Central African, rather than the Khoisan, Central African Bayaka hunters, a menstruating woman is Ekila, in the moon, and the moon is called her biggest husband. It's the work of our colleague Jerome Lewis in this department. With the Hadza, the moon is a woman's brother, and a Hadza woman, to know when she's going to menstruate, will simply look at the sky for the moon to tell her. For both the Hadza and for the Bayaka in Central Africa, a woman should not be in sexual contact with her husband, and he can't hunt while she's menstruating, or else the animals will smell him. The ritual life of the Bayaka provides a perfect example of Lunarchy in action. Women's collective Ngoku spirit takes over the camp before the men's collective Ejengi spirit pushes back. Morna Finnegan describes this sensual repartee between male and female ritual collectives animating the political pendulum at the heart of the community. Each sex, under the moon's sway, takes power in turn. To resolve the ritual tension would be to freeze the momentum and allow hierarchy to flood back in. By keeping everything moving, you maintain an egalitarianism, a kind of seesaw. The Hadza also use the lunar cycle for their principal ritual framework with their ethereal rituals of ephemer, with women singing and men dancing, women singing ancient polyphonic songs only under a moonless sky where the whole Milky Way is stretched out over them. But, okay, of course, those are hunter-gatherers who are bringing their songs and dances right into the 21st century, still today, even in the face of all the destruction of extractive capital, they're still doing it. The resilience of that, the sustainability of that, tens of thousands of years later in their culture. But where is the moon today? For more than half of us who now live in cities, and I'm just going to show the beautiful picture which John Cox took. John, it was last year's moonrise at midsummer, full moonrise over the city of London, the moon rising over the Essex marshes, that deep blue bed of cloud there, with on the south bank the Shard, and on the north bank the city of London, the evil empire itself, and the cranes or the building sites seeming to salute the moonrise there. Even in the most impoverished, denuded urban landscape, people are still experiencing daily cycles, the Earth's spin, and annual cycles of movement around the sun. But our connection to lunar cyclicity is more and more fragmented. We're cut off from the moon in the sky of cityscapes. We can hardly see it. We don't know where it rises and sets or when it is in its phase. There are children born in cities who've never seen the Milky Way beyond the nighttime glare, and the stars are fading in the sky. There'll be a generation soon who won't even see stars, never mind the Milky Way. If the moon really mattered to the evolution of human bodies, then this is a matter of environmental, physical, and mental health. We evolved under the sway of the moon. Scientific discourse, as Chris has told us, it very nervously mentions the moon. You know, it might be all right for talking about the reproduction of sea creatures, or beetles or insects, or researching lion ecology. But as soon as it comes close to human beings, the moon must mean, oh, the environment, the Enlightenment's rational tradition in male-only theological colleges had trouble with two entities, or was scared of two entities, women and the moon. But the question of what made us human can't be solved without attention to women, the moon, and menstruation. African hunter-gatherer cosmology takes the lunar cycle as a crucial time frame for ritual, sexual, and economic activities. The shared sources of this cosmology carry us back to the earliest human symbolic culture, the very origins of art and ritual itself over 100,000 years ago. These hunter-gatherer societies are among the most gender egalitarian on earth. But how does that egalitarianism work? Women especially assert power through their bodies collectively to resist any threat of male exploitation. As the moon waxes and wanes, the dynamic of power switches in more or less playful battles between the sexes. No one rules but the moon. That's what Lunarchy means. The moon is in charge. Could Lunarchy offer us a way to decolonize time and reclaim our revolutionary heritage as humans? Remember, E.P. Thompson put it, talking about the emergence of industrial political economy, the stress of transition falls upon the whole culture. So as we go back to the future, it will involve the whole culture, ritual, sexual, political, economic, artistic, everything you want to think of in human life. Lunarchy's essential logic is no one wins or dominates for good. In the theatre of Lunarchy, rather like carnival, the populace triumphs in one phase, in the other, the powers that be. Drawing on this human egalitarian expertise, why don't we let the trickster government take the power in one phase, the waxing moon, surrendering to the bankers' regimes as the moon wanes, but only on condition of strike again at the new moon. No longer one woman all alone nagging about her torn knickers. As we heard in that old St. Monday song, The Jovial Cutlers, this should be a strike of all womankind with a planet to win. And menstruation's the flag. To win back time, we need menstrual leave taking from the earth to the moon. I've just got a last little bit, which is reflections from the COVID time, because it's sorry. Oh. Is that better? That probably is easier to see. Reflections from the COVID time, because that opened up an extraordinary space-time for reflection. So I've called it COVID struck, moon struck. It's just a little coda left and I'm nearly finished. There are two UCL scientists here who just before COVID, Simon Lewis and Mark Maslin, called for two things to stop climate catastrophe and environment collapse. First, everyone should have universal basic income to take care of all basic needs. Second, we have to rewild half the planet, half Earth, they called it. I have the very strong proviso that that can only be done with the indigenous custodians in charge. It's not the job of capitalists to do that or Westerners to do that. The economic collapse that was conjured out of nowhere by coronavirus provoked very vociferous calls for the UBI. And of course, we had the example of furlough for very large parts of the working population, even from Tories, even from reluctant socialists. The threat of COVID taught us to rewild our time, at least some of us. So is this the formula? Half and half, half space, half time, half Earth, half moon. Very simple, basic formula. In the COVID-struck 2020 Northern Spring, we were suddenly, some of us, it was very class differentiated, people on the front line, people running around in the gig economy, delivering stuff, people who had plenty of time on their hands, suddenly able to take time back from the excess demands of turbo-capitalism, releasing a certain creativity, reflection, above all, a time for the planet to rest. Okay, it didn't last long. There was some respite, there was some reduction of all the, the extraction from the earth. There was supposed to be building back better, but of course, now it's business as usual. As the planet won desperate needed respite, we fell under a spell as if the Sleeping Beauty pricked her finger and fell asleep for 100 years. Now, in the fairy tale, which we talked about around Christmas, that long sleep resulted from a man denying his daughter's cyclical pulse of fertility, refusing to let her bleed. How we emerge is going to depend on whether we can restore a sustainable pulse to our life on Earth. Imagine we could calibrate a rhythm which was seclusion, activity, pause, action, virtual, physical, according to the phases of the moon. Imagine we could restore the Earth-Moon dance, celebration of her and our menstrual cycles as a guarantee of future fertility. Because all humans share that pulse, the peoples of the world would become entrained, enchanted, ensorcelled by the ancient rhythms of our past. This ritual periodicity has both global, universal spread and capacity, but it is also got local cultural efficacy, all the different cultural ways of responding to that cycle. We would then be able to see, hear, touch, taste, and smell the difference that dance made to our beautiful world. We breathing new fresh air, finding time for our children and grandparents, hearing the birds and insects return. We would have realized how important sharing properly was for our health and the health of our mother. It's not only perfectly humanly possible, it's natural to us. It's Lunarchy. So that's. Thanks for listening to all that. I'm sorry it took a little while to go through. Do you want to hold chair or? Yes, well, I think that's meant to open up discussion because some of you may be furious and think it's absolutely crazy. And oh, you've got Bernie already ready on Zoom, and when we can come back. Bernie, do you want to
say something?
Say something?
So first of all, I thought the presentation was brilliant. Will it be posted on YouTube for the wider audience?
On YouTube? Aha.
Yeah, you have a channel.
Well, we've got them on Vimeo. We'll probably put it onto Vimeo, but we'll think about YouTube as well.
Okay, that's perfect because this is brilliant. I thought it was very perceptive about your associating the Christian Jesus to the trickster. It's one of those things that's like in front of us, but just about everybody, including me, didn't see it. I thought that was amazing. And maybe
but it's the Bushmen did it.
The Bushmen see it, yeah, they see it, yeah. I totally missed that one. And maybe some words from Billy Joel. You may be right, I may be crazy, but it just may be a lunatic you're looking for.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Lovely. Thanks. Did people hear that all right? It's coming over. Good. Any more on Zoom or anybody in the audience who'd like to comment or question the ETA?
No, not a question. I mean, I had suddenly, I made all sorts of associations and more kind of reflections. One, of course, is the Marshall Sahlins affluent society, and affluence is all about time. When people are forced into a labor economy or a cash economy, they're suddenly labeled lazy because they have they abide to natural time, and leisure time is not wasted time, is just spent on what the body needs, the other thing is that on a personal
yeah, it would be better if we did use so people can hear, but I can repeat. Yeah, we did practice, so I'll do it. Oh, you know how to do it. Yeah, go. So I can say something about silence. Yeah.
Hello. No. Hello. No.
Is it on? Have you got it? Try again.
No. Is it doing?
Yeah, you've got to hold it quite close.
Yeah. So the Marshall Sahlins sort of
the original affluent society.
The affluence is time affluence.
Yep.
On a personal experience, when we moved from London to North Norfolk, our time changed. Now we're really learning about the moon a lot more. It's the stars. We're learning because, of course, there's technology, there's apps and things and stuff. And you know that at a certain time you get home, whatever Ryan is the best, if it's not there, and then you know the car is whatever. So it's sort of little things that at least we've been able to do. But the other reflection that I have is, of course, language. That turbo capitalism is based on growth. So there's only waxing. There's
never any
waning, and that language that persists doesn't, it just doesn't want to that for any waning.
Yep.
So,
and it's an ideologically driven propaganda that never relaxes, absolutely never relaxes, has to constantly stress people, or they're afraid they'll fall off the belt. Yeah. So yeah, that observation about Salins and the original affluent society, there's been a lot of debate and kind of critique of the Salins idea, that the argument where he tried to calculate a lot of, literally calories and obtaining calories by hours and minutes amongst the jeunes poissi, the Hong, as they were called. And the people have critiqued it and say, oh, he left out all of women's work and the processing being done by women. So again, that work being done by women was just not being counted. So people have said, well, actually, they were doing nearly as much of a working week as people here today, perhaps. But the whole idea is that, they're using time, they're maintaining, they're just doing enough for feeding themselves, for maintaining welfare amongst the whole group. They're not trying to accumulate. These are very egalitarian, so-called immediate return hunter-gatherer societies, and they are not time poor, whereas time poverty has become an increasingly important concept for people in the weird world, the so-called Western, so-called educated, industrial, rich, so-called democratic parts of the world. And yeah, so it's a very good observation. It goes with that. Yeah, thanks. Lex, do you want to pass back for Lex? You need to speak quite close on the microphone. If it's on, that's great. Any more on Zoom, please put up your hands. Any messages that would be good to know about? Lex.
Thank you for your talk. I think that your mind is incredible and you're so right. And to be honest, I think the whole of London should have been here. I think the whole of the world should have been here. And they don't know they're missing. They're going to find out one day. I just was going to ask you how you said that the monks were named after emperors. I have two questions. Also, what did you do the names? How do we categorize the names if there were names for this different names for a year?
Sorry, say that again. How I would.
So
I
just like 13 names a year. Other names, And also.
Well, the real. Oh, I see. Right. Okay. Okay, but there are. All right. Okay.
And then also, I wanted to know how the 7-day week is based on lunar time. And one more question. And what would you advise to start making small changes in everyday life? You might know.
That's a tricky one, yes.
That's very tricky.
Yeah. Well, there are lots of different systems worldwide for giving names to particular moons that would correlate the moons with particular times of year in relation to the types of plants or the types of animals. Now, the real expert here is Bernie, who's going to be telling us more about this later in the term with his work on the Upper Paleolithic and his comparisons. Bernie, maybe you want to throw something in about the Siberian calendar systems and so forth. And there are many different systems, Native American, Siberian, all around the world. I don't know if the Hadza, where I've worked, have different names for different moons. They will relate to wet and dry seasons and moons in the moons, critical moons will be moons in relation either to the rains or to dry seasons, because that will be times of kind of critical food shortage and when they'll need to do special things then. So there could be all kinds of systems of that. And yeah, so yeah, that is open to our imagination of what becomes ritually imagined. What do we share as ritual experience? What do we share as what do we value? What do we want to build on? And the second question was a 7-day week. Yeah, I mean, it's like quarters of the moon, with Moon Day named at the start of the week, and Sunday Sabbaths very significant. For the actual lunar cycle, you'd need you'd need to have a 1-bit day of kind of spare as an extra. But what you often see in lunar calendars organizing like African systems is that those days of dark moon, they will be described in Bantu systems as days of blood, when people do not work, when people may fast, when there'll be kind of downtime. So you could envisage 7-day units organizing time. I mean, the most fundamental basic organization time is waxing and waning, obviously that is, but you could use a system of calling Moon Day, the quarter, the day when the quarter goes, or something like that. These are possibilities now. But it's really the full and the new moon poles that would be decisive. And we can envisage, a fortnight on, a fortnight off, and that could be also with 4-day week. Why don't we've got these movements for 4-day weeks as well, so why not pull that in as well? And the last bit was, that's the tough one, because, well, I don't know how many people in this room walked in and knew what the phase of the moon was. Yeah, I want Lex to say a little bit more about why. So that is like 2, 3, 4, 5 in the whole room. So this is no blame on you. In a city, to know and see the moon is really difficult, and it kind of depends on.
Do you want to tell the story about the Hadza who wondered where we got a moon?
Do you want to tell the story? I mean, yeah, we had. I mean, no. First of all, Hadza the Hadza Tanzanian hunter-gatherers still operating. Some of them still operating, as living in the bush today. Young children, when the moon is below the horizon, you ask them, where's the moon? And they will be able to point to where it is and where it's going to rise. It's just so much part of organization of their life and time. And the major Hadza rituals, which are healing rituals called epime, can only happen at the time of a dark moon, when the visibility of the Milky Way is there. So we had a couple of Hadza young men come to talk in London.
2 Hadza men
stayed
in my flat in Hackney, and they got quite worried about their health, because they needed at dark moon to do epime, otherwise they just felt they're going to be ill. But it's kind of worse than that. I mean, they couldn't really do epime because you need quite a lot of women. You need 10 or 12 women singing to do epime, and none of us would, no women over in Hackney would have known
how to sing epime
song. But kind of worse than that, they said, have you even got a moon? Is there a moon in London? We haven't seen it. Now, they had been to a lecture which I'd given, and I had a big projection of the moon on the screen. And they said, well, we saw that fake moon which you produced with a machine, but actually, do you have the moon? And they were seriously concerned about their health, because epime is absolutely necessary. You need to do epime. You need to take this time off from all the conflicts and jealousies and all.
It's healing, reconciliation.
Epime is everyone
in the hunt.
Everyone becomes formally not sexually related. Everyone becomes in some formal sense brothers and sisters, as opposed to husbands and wives, which kind of immediately has an effect in getting rid of a lot of the jealousies, of course. And you just need to do that in order to keep yourselves healthy, as well as as the rest of the landscape. And in particular, what impressed me when I was in Hudson country with everyone. Camilla sort of mentioned it, but it's that they had this absolute strict rule about light pollution. It's like not just the moon had to be dark to see the Milky Way, but you had to any kind of little cigarette light, any lantern, any cattle herder with a lamp or something. All the lights had to be out, because any light pollution would interfere with the communication between this world and the spirits, which were in some sort of way connected, ancestral spirits, some way connected with the stars. So, and I took that up in an activity where on Earth Day in 2009, I managed to get nearly all Canary Wharf's office lights turned off for an hour. Through, I won't go exactly how it was to do. It took quite a lot of effort, but I had to get the management of Canary Wharf and those huge buildings to go around to all the people in charge of the lighting to sort of say there's a real bad danger of somewhat difficult things happening to all that glass unless Earth Hour was respected. And so all these posters were put up not by me, but the different managements of those huge buildings. And I think
this was at the time of the bankers crash.
This was the time of the bankers crash, and Camilla and Ian were up on Greenwich,
right up in Hilly
Hilly
Fields, so we
Fields.
could see the evil empire.
And for an hour, all the lights gradually went out, and I thought, Eureka, I've done it. So
you actually had a dark sky.
I was
Well,
very,
nearly,
very
nearly.
proud of that.
Yeah. I mean, it's so difficult, but yeah, that was quite an effort. I don't know. It's about an increasing awareness of when is the moon in its phase, where is it, and somehow in all the various ways. I mean, look, we've had Ramadan through this month, which is organized through the moon. We've had a pile up of all these, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, all of them organized through the moon, and Hinduism, but all of these religions. So there are just so many possibilities for restoring those boundaries of time with the moon. It's like this Gregorian calendar is squatting on it, like pressing it down, suppressing it. If we could just shift it, you get this, restore this awareness and respect. I wonder, Lex, you ought to say a little bit about some of the work you've been doing on this subject. Just mention it, because Lex is an amazing artist.
Well, I've been making it's called a moon clock, and it's a clock that goes anti-clockwise, and it's tiny. And all you have to do is turn it manually once a day, and it will tell you the moon phase once a day. It will also tell you when your menstruation is going to start and end, and it's like your clock is on the wall of your body, and also the sky, the window, it's the same. That's what I've been doing.
It's just a very practical, everyday reminder of moon phase and the potential link to your body. Yeah. Could you use the little mic, and you need to put the mic close.
Observation. In the olden days, when we didn't have phones or anything like that, we went digital, it was very analog. We used to have diaries, and the phases of the moon were in there every day.
Yes, yes.
Yes.
Mm.
And I was always told as a child that was so, when we lived in the countryside, you'd be able to walk home in the dark when it was full moon. But I'm sure that's just what my granny told me. But we did use, even in my lifetime, the moon.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Every time I receive, somebody gives me a Gregorian calendar, they've eliminated most of the phases of the moon, and I laboriously go through putting the phases of the moon onto it. But I still am waiting for a calendar designed, which is organized by the moon phase, not by the dates of Gregorian. And this is the huge, I mean, it really is the challenge of reclaiming time. That is the fortress of white supremacy and turbo capitalism. That is that organization. But we've got all these advantages. We've got our bodies, we've got our evolved psychology, we've got that connection. So we should be able to do it. Please. Again, either shout or take the, if you could pass the mic out, thanks.
Yeah, I was just wondering, so with your previous examples of political systems being organized on basically lunarly, so for example, you said the communism of motion.
Communism.
Were there any examples of conflict or tension or some, say, for example, the men try and say, can we have a day more kind of thing? And say if we were to implement this relaxation, capitalism, baggers, that side of dichotomy, would, like, how do we then account for that tendency that tends to come up with use all the time to
Yeah.
continue?
Well, yeah, that is a really, really interesting question, which could go in all kinds of directions. I'm also thinking of, some of you may have heard of the Graeber-Wengrow Dawn of Everything, where they're talking about these, you know, the possibilities of all kinds of political systems in ancient human populations, and particularly that focuses on seasonality, and that certain points of the year there might be sort of uprisings that overthrew the hierarchy, and that people designed this kind of uprisings for their own entertainment almost. Sorry, carnival, well, kind of carnivalesque. But if you take that over on a seasonal framework, it means that the powers that be can have a lot longer stretch of time to ensconce themselves. So if you remove from the lunar rhythm to a solar rhythm, you're conceding so much to the potential of patriarchy or of stratification to take the power for the most of the time. And yeah, the people just have a bit of fun for a couple of days, including women, of course. The beauty of, exactly as you said, one of the things is communism in motion. The beauty of the lunar framework is the equality there, the egalitarianism there. And the other point that you could go into is the struggle over the measurement of lunar time, because all these great monuments, whether we're talking about the North American monuments, the monumental architecture, all over Europe and into Asia, and all these great monuments with their measurements of skyline, skyscape archaeology, tracking. I mean, John Cox knows a lot more about this. I don't know if John wants to intervene. Tracking constellations, tracking certain lunar alignments and so on. But the question is, which moon are you measuring? Because the moon that's 29.5, which a human sees going from phase to phase on the Earth, is what women's bodies evolved with. That's like the women's moon, if you like, but it's all of humanity's moon, because women, children, men evolved with that. But the sidereal moon is a 27-day cycle that kind of, as elites, esoteric knowledge, shamans, men start to create secret societies which have this special knowledge. And our late colleague Lionel Sims, focusing on Stonehenge and Avebury, was looking at how that manipulated knowledge and ideology of the sidereal moon was entrenching patriarchal control. So these are, the patriarchy is a very complicated relationship with the moon, taking control of the knowledge of the moon and saying, oh, you women, you're mere bodies, whereas we know that the real spirit. Yeah, there's always this potential.
On the question you asked about communism in motion, Jerome, who's worked all these years with Benjedi in the Western Congo, has described this alternation. What happens is that women, as Camilla mentioned, have Ngoku, which is a women's uprising, really, but it's kind of playful. But the women all link arms, they storm into the camp, they're all teasing, they're all very sexually provocative, but they're kind of teasing and taunting the men. And the men look a bit uncomfortable, a bit embarrassed, but they're not, the older and braver of them to put up with it all. And then it's like the women get a bit fed up with being on top. And after a few days, maybe a week or so, they kind of, they think we've made our point, and there's a period of kind of not much happening in the way of ritual. But after a while, the men decide, okay, we're going to strut our stuff, and they do a jengi. I think you're right that there could be actually conflict, that the men might want to be able to do a jengi a little bit longer and spread it out a bit more. But actually, the healthy situation is that the women will actually not, they will object to it. Enough is enough. You've shown yourself, you've stomped around the place, you've shown your muscle, you've shown that stuff where we like all that muscle and stuff, but enough is enough kind of thing. There was a period, wasn't there, Camilla, when the women's Ngoku in that area fell into disuse. The women didn't do the Ngoku for a while.
Ingrid, yeah.
Ingrid
Ingrid
described
said
it,
so,
and
yeah.
it actually took a bit odd, but it sort of took Ingrid during his life to say, come on, women, we've got to get the Ngoku back up again.
To
You know,
maintain the balance.
because Ingrid is the Ngoku, she's initiated into the Ngoku.
She could get
She
it
was able to persuade women that they need to get it going. And ever since then, it's been going.
Mm.
But I mean, the men sort of were kind of apparently happy to leave the women not doing it because it's all a bit embarrassing to them. But
In the Kalahari situation, where there's been a long time since there's been really a sustainable hunting practice because of all the stealing of the land by colonizers, occupation farmers, and so forth. The healing trance ceremonies with healers have become quite almost a profitable industry. There's quite a lot of tourist trade, a lot of just with other groups than the hunting gathering groups, cattle groups, and so on. So that's been continuing. But women's first menstruation rituals have really been dying out. Partly that's a result of missionizing, education, and because basically hunting is gone. Without the hunting, the women's menstruation magic loses its validity. So we've again had a sort of loss of the balance, because we're losing the women's side, whilst the men maintain actually get a bigger profile of the healing and their prestige through that. So there's all kinds of ways that can skew very readily, and it's tough. Yes, and John, did you want to say something? I don't know if you had your hand up. Did you want to say something? Can I come to John and then I'll come to you? John?
Yes, madly, I published a lunar calendar for 12 years. It was a big effort. I used to sell it at compendium books, just in Camden Town. They always took about 50, and that used to keep it going. But it had a kind of Tibetan bias. The Tibetan calendar is quite interesting in that sense, that it has on the 8th day, which is like 7 days from your first visible moon, then you have Tara and Mahakala, which are sort of guardians.
Mm-hmm.
You get Rinpoche on the 10th day. He's a kind of proselytizing man for Buddhism. You get Buddha on the 15th day,
which would be just after full moon, yeah?
On full moon. Or just after. Yes, because the day count tends to be just slightly in lag, tends to be like half a day or a day in lag, because you start with the first visible moon. And then right at the very end, you get, on the 29th day, you get these terrifying Mahakala and really quite frightening people. The Dakinis come in on the 25th day, 5 days before the dark moon. You have the sort of female protective element. But then on the very last day, it's all pretty terrifying. And then off you go again.
Yeah. That's
for another month.
Yeah, can we get some more calendars with all this info? Yeah, it's wonderful. And Dasha has put up a link for a calendar as well, which would be very interesting to see. I'll have a look for that. Yeah, thanks, John. We had another in the room. Would you like to say talk on the mic?
Thank you. And arriving late. I just wanted to go back to your concept about the possibility of the week, well, the week of very obvious division of days. And I'm interested in the origin of the weekend. How did that develop? When societies as a whole suddenly decided to have the same initially one day off. And do you think that might have been sort of flagging time in order so that you could have weeks of slightly different number of days, so that you would? Okay, you're not shaking your head, so
No, no, I'm not. No, go on.
No, my maths is so good off my. Would that be able to see have an organized day of rest every now and then, so that the odd half day and the fact that the moon isn't a whole day fits in with the 7 day with I guess a 6 to 7 day week that would change.
Yeah.
And that spare day, the flabby day, would be the first of the perhaps organized days off. I'm just guessing.
Yeah, potentially. No, just should say, I mean, those are it's a Middle Eastern tradition with it, and God has the day of rest, and it probably goes back before the Judaic traditions. And there are many different, there are African traditions with 4-day weeks, but then you can use 4-day weeks to make 7 weeks of a moon as well. So these weekends, how they Sabbaths, Fridays, Saturday, Sunday being the day, whichever day it is, you know, there are various ways to do it. Do you want to say something?
One of the most exhaustive classic studies of that was, of course, Robert Grippo's amazing 3-volume work, The Mothers. And he pointed out that if you go back, you can find that the Sabbath was originally a once a month thing. The Sabbath was once a month, every dark moon. And the Sabbath would have been about 3 days, the days of blood. And then over time, that long period, once a month thing gets chopped up, and then it was like once a half month, once a quarter. And so the present sort of Sunday thing is as Camilla was saying, it's a once a quarter. And so all of those processes of chopping up that monthly thing are a process of distancing from the moon, chopping up the moon, diminishing the influence of the moon. But the idea of a period of rest would originally have been, we think, the whole half. You wouldn't be doing certain kinds of things, sex, consumption, all that sort of stuff. You'd be in ritual mode for, in a way on strike for a whole half the month. And I was just going to say, when Camilla was talking about all the different things which are going on today in terms of religious convergences and all sorts of other possible opportunities for restoring Lunarchy, I don't think we should forget this incredible outbreak of strikes and picket lines, not just in this country, but in France and Germany and everywhere else. When you're on strike, you're basically saying, right, this is our time. And of course, people are doing it for a reason. They're doing it because they're fed up with all this stuff. But on the other hand, you can imagine a time when perhaps these strikes start to converge, and people actually I mean, I remember the dockers strike, when the dockers were on strike for 2 years, and I was heavily involved in it all. The dockers actually kind of loved it. They said, we've never worked so hard as when we've been on strike. We've been working a different kind of work, so networking, solidarity all over the planet, organizing the strike. But of course, if you were on strike all the time, we'd all starve. So, it would be quite a good idea to be on strike a lot of the time, claiming back time, but kind of giving capitalism half the time. But except, of course, if we did that, it wouldn't be capitalism. It would be like pretend play capitalism. If we say, oh, Con, you want to pretend to be bankers and all this stuff, you can do it for 2 weeks, but you're not going to have more than 2 weeks. So you won't be able to accumulate the power which goes with wealth. You can just, but on the other hand, all those jobs do need doing. Just being on strike all the time wouldn't work. But perhaps that would be a way of getting back to 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off, which would then satisfy these other demands we're getting more and more, which is to have, a 4-day week, a 3-day week, I mean, it's no question, everyone that's tried those things, every company that's tried those things, we get more work done when people are relaxed and rested than if you make them work for 5 days a week. So I think a 2 week on, 2 week off thing will be absolutely brilliant news for the planet and for all of us. And it would get back to the, as Camilla was saying, to the rhythm we evolved with.
John again. Thank you.
John.
Have you finished?
Yeah, I think.
Well done.
Yep.
John again. And Mike Harbison had a rather interesting question to say something too. Anyway, John.
The 10-day week.
I think people are in.
There are 3 10-day weeks in a lunar month. You've got a week of 10 days when the moon is getting stronger.
Mm-hmm.
You've got a week when the moon is strong, and then you've got a week of 10 days when the moon is getting weaker again. And this is quite a natural way of parceling out a month if you're not tied to tied down by the man, which most people are, of course. There you go.
Yeah. That's another one to think about. Yeah, that I suppose actually that could correct. I mean, the actual time period for the Hadza of Epime goes from last quarter, because it depends when the moon's going to rise or set in the night when there's darkness. And so from last quarter to 3 days after the moon changes to waxing, after dark moon. So that is about 10 days pretty much. So you're right about that. That is about it. Right, we've got people starting to go, but Mike Harbison, you had a question, if you're still there, Mike, on annual ceremonies amongst hunter-gatherer groups, and there are occasions or happenings when there's an intersection between the kind of lunar cycle and important seasonal shifts. But it should be said that hunter-gatherers can operate their economy by the moon very successfully. It's a very good unit of time for planning and organizing large game hunting, and then for producing a lot of food for the group, and then relaxing until you have to do it again in the next moon. So the moon works beautifully for hunting and gathering cultures, whereas annual is really a shift towards agriculture, because obviously the moon isn't the unit that counts for agriculture, although there are many traditions maintaining lunar influence within agriculture and horticulture of supposed planting by the moon, which is some sort of continuity perhaps. Yeah, so that's a very interesting question. On the hunter-gatherer groups, but we need to stop. But Tam, did you want one last word? I think that's it.
One last word. Thanks very much. It was astounding, Camilla, and I'm glad it's recorded because there was just so much. I'm going to need to go back to it, but it's just on just a couple of theatrical elements that me, because the first play I was ever in was called Dark of the Moon, where I played Witch Boy. And last week I saw the David Bowie Aladdin Sane exhibition in the South Bank, which just opened because it's 50 years, half a century since that album came out, with the song called Time that meant so much then as well. And that song is about theatricalizing time. Time is waiting in the wings. He speaks of those things. His script is you and me. But maybe above all on this idea that you just brought up about annual traditions, that one that's just come up is the idea of pantomime all year round, that it shouldn't just be Christmas. There's an article in The Stage this week about that, and that it used to happen at Easter as well, and this would be such a good thing.
Yeah.
Holiday.
I mean, there is so many resources. Pantomime's mega resource of ritual, with laughter and subversion, absolutely, gender ambiguity, subversion, everything. You know, Mama's plays, all this ancient stuff. It isn't that ancient. It was a few centuries ago. It's pre-capitalist. Carnival used to occupy almost a third of the year with feast days and holy days. You know, that is what was stolen from us by the process that E.P. Thompson documented. There are so many ritual artistic resources for us to reclaim time, to rediscover and reclaim time. There's absolutely no question about it. Those 12 days of Christmas, well, I'd like to change them into 13, but anyway, yeah, exactly. There's all these possibilities. And we can take along all the religions in their various ways. So yeah, we're needing to stop really. We've got one more last word. We're only at thank you, Tam, that was great.
Thank you, that was wonderful.
Quickly.
Quick. Because I've recently visited Lithuania, I've been fascinated by, and I've really got to get into all their legends and things because there's so much, because they got Christianized in the late 1300s. Right, they have kind of a prehistory, that's what the first ones, but their month names, I mean, they have 12 names, but they're all seasonal and they're not all agricultural.
Sure, yeah. Okay.
They're all to do with what bird comes
Yeah.
what leaf comes out at this time,
Sure.
what's dry, what's wet.
Great.
Yeah,
Some of that may has an old history. I'm just going to have to say goodbye. I wish I could have talked to everybody on this subject. Just to mention, please come back next week. We've got another wonderful talk from Helen Cornish, who was with us last term for the anthropology and the environment panel we had. But Helen's going to be talking on navigating history and anthropology, modern witches and expanded historicities. She's done a lot of research on modern witchcraft movements, and that should be a wonderful talk. So please come back next Tuesday. We are again live at UCL if you can come to UCL, but otherwise we'll be on Zoom. Thank you very much to the Zoom people for joining us. It's always great to see you, and hope to see you again next week. Bye-bye. I'm going to end off. Thank you.